The Soviet Experiment with Empire. I'm Blair Fix. What had come to an end was not history itself, but an empire whose time had run out. Karl Schlegel in The Soviet Century. In my last post, The Half-Life of Empire, I charted the rise and fall of the British and U.S. empires, as measured by their share of world energy use. Afterwards, several readers requested that I apply the same methods to the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Here's my attempt to do so. Figure 1 shows my estimates for the rise and fall of the Soviet Empire, as measured by its share of world energy use. The Soviet half-life, the period spent to and from the halfway mark of peak dominance, lasted for 60 years, from 1926 to 1992. Some backstory. The Soviet Union formed out of the ashes of the Russian Empire, which itself dates back to the early 18th century. Unlike the British Empire, which industrialized during the 19th century, the Russian Empire remained largely agrarian. It was one of the last places to allow serfdom. Hence, Russia saw little material growth during the 1800s. That would change with the Russian Revolution, which began in 1917. After a half-decade of internal turmoil mixed with imperial conquest, the Red Army proclaimed victory and created the Soviet Union in 1922. Afterwards, the Soviet regime embarked on a period of intense industrialization, organized around a series of 5-year plans. As a result, Soviet energy use exploded. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union reached its peak level of dominance, consuming slightly more than 15% of the world's energy. Then, after coasting for several decades, the late 1980s saw the Soviet government embroiled in a series of crises which ultimately proved insurmountable. By 1992, the Soviet regime had collapsed, and the remaining Russian state fell into a deep depression. Today, Russia's share of world energy use is less than a third of the Soviet peak. The Soviet experience, burning bright and collapsing fast. Returning to wider imperial history, one of the intriguing features of the British and U.S. empires is that despite their apparent differences, they've had a curiously similar rhythm. Both empires rose and fell over the course of 2 centuries, and both empires had a half-life of about 100 years. Figure 2 shows the similarities. Is this shared timeline a universal feature of imperial history, a sign that all empires have a fixed destiny? Turning to the Soviet example, the answer seems to be no. Figure 3 makes the case. Compared to Britain and the United States, the Soviet Union rose and fell more abruptly. And that makes sense. Both the beginning and the end of the Soviet Empire were punctuated by revolution. The Soviet Union was created when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsarist regime and instituted state communism. And the communist regime died when the Soviet government collapsed and was replaced by capitalist oligarchy. In contrast, the British and U.S. empires rose and fell with far less internal conflict, and so their histories of dominance and decline are smoother, at least so far. Looking to the future, it seems unlikely that American politicians will manage to reverse the U.S. descent into imperial irrelevance. But what could happen is that U.S. politics devolve into revolution and/or civil war, similar to when the Soviet Union collapsed. If that happens, expect a punctuated decline of American power. The Cold War in hindsight. While we've got the Soviet energy data in hand, let's revisit some Cold War history. According to standard lore, the Cold War consisted of a protracted struggle between 2 superpowers, one capitalist and one communist. In the end, the story goes, the United States won the battle because of the superiority of capitalism. Turning to the energy data, the empirical story is rather different. As Figure 4 shows, the U.S. exited World War II as the world's sole superpower. In 1945, it consumed about 37% of the world's energy. In that year, the Soviet share of world energy use sat at just under 11%, less than a third of the U.S. value. In this context, it seems inappropriate to call the Soviet Union a superpower. It was a rival empire, yes, but at the dawn of the Cold War, there was no real competition. The U.S. utterly dominated the global picture. Over the next 40 years, however, things changed. From the 1950s onward, U.S. dominance gradually waned, while the Soviet Union managed to maintain its share of the world energy pie. The result was a gradual convergence between the two powers. Indeed, this convergence is the real story of the Cold War, as Figure 5 shows. From the dawn of the conflict in 1947 to the end in 1991, Soviet energy consumption consistently increased relative to the United States. Of course, when the Soviet regime collapsed in 1991, the energy convergence ended. But should we read this collapse as a testament to the innate superiority of capitalism over communism? In some ways, the answer is yes, simply because things that die prematurely can hardly be called superior. And yet, while it existed, the Soviet regime was remarkably effective at closing the energy gap with the United States. The reasons are not mysterious. To a large extent, industrialization is a project of infrastructure build-out. To industrialize, you lay railways, you pave highways, you erect cities, and you construct massive factories. And the truth is that these huge projects are always done by large, hierarchically controlled organizations. So the question is not whether industrialization should involve central planning. The question is whether the central planning should be state-dominated or corporate-dominated. The US, and Britain before it, opted for the corporate-dominated approach. The Soviet Union opted for the state-dominated approach. Since it ultimately collapsed, we know that the Soviet state-dominated approach had a problem with staying power. In this regard, the corporate-dominated approach to industrialization has an advantage in that individual firms are usually small enough that they can fail without breaking the whole system. That said, while it survived, the state-dominated approach to industrialization was remarkably successful. Figure 6 shows some of the big Soviet infrastructure projects. Looking at this industrial history, the economist Branko Milanovic argues that actually existing communism proved to be starkly different than the utopia envisioned by Karl Marx. While Marx saw communism as the final stage of social evolution, real-world communism seems to have been an alternative state-dominated path to industrialization. A path that either collapsed into corporate capitalism, as in Russia, or evolved into corporate capitalism more gracefully, as in China. Either way, the road to industrialization ended with corporate oligarchy. Of course, given the unfolding ecological calamity, it seems doubtful that the oligarchic system has a long-term future, but that's a topic for another time. Hi folks, Blair Fix here. I'm a crowdfunded scientist who shares all of his painstaking research for free. If you think my work has value, consider becoming a supporter. You can sign up at economicsfromthetopdown.com/membership. And if you're interested in the data and methods behind the charts, you can find a link in the notes.